Okay, the third piece I'm going to be talking about is actually a zine. So it's called Trauma, a zine about survival, exploitation, and healing. And it's by a trans woman, Tash Wolfe, who's queer and lives in Vancouver. She's a friend of mine and was gracious enough to give me access to the zine that she produced, and it's all about trans bodies, queer bodies, and trauma, and the ways that they're all sort of intertwined. And the Sexual Assault Support Center at UBC had a copy, and they did that kind of cool thing that you get to do with zines, which is that you get to photocopy them for other people. And it's actually on the back. It says, please copy, share, and support Knives Out. So I didn't end up using it in my paper, which breaks my heart. And there's a couple of reasons why. A lot of it involving like what my business as a cis dude was with this piece, and like working it into paper felt kind of weird. And then like more practically, it's hard to cite zines in essays. But what I love so much about this, other than like just like the really brutally honest and like beautiful prose and poetry that are kind of weaved in and out of the 40 pages here, is that this also operates in this sense of like just like very much shiftedness and confusion in text. And it reminds me a lot actually about the book Koolaids, which I don't think I'll make an independent video of, but I certainly will mention it here. In that Koolaids, the book jumps between Lebanon and San Francisco so often that you don't really know where you are. And I got this feeling a lot with this text, and it's similar in that to Feinberg's work, in that there's all sorts of different relationships being documented here, and each one is sort of being shown to be like its own type of cultural production. The last poem in this book, or the zine, is called Ghosts. And it plays out this final, it's Ghost 3, there's 3 versions of Ghosts, and this is the final version, and it plays out this sort of fetishization of the trans body by cis people. In this version, it's this woman, Annie, who calls herself like a cis ally. And what ends up happening is like this total like lack of consent in this relationship. It's like just ends up being really abusive, all under the guise of sort of like feminist, anti-racist, transpositive thoughts and theory. And it just gets me thinking that trauma itself doesn't come from like the good and the bad guys. Like there's not this sort of dichotomy operating. It's much more complicated and much more, I think, insidious. That this one character, Annie, uses, feminist anti-racist scholarship and work. They're reading zines to each other at the very beginning of the poem, right? Like this, and like talking about consent and what it means. These are all being deployed in very particular ways, especially against trans women, I think the argument is. So she says, Tash writes, I knew what was happening with Annie. This scenario repeated itself with every moment of intimacy that we shared. While I was able to run from Kobe and distance myself from Jimmy, those are 2 other relationships that she mentions in the book, it was difficult to name the actions that Annie took. I knew that my lack of consent was being broken. I did not have any doubt about this. Still, the way that cis people take ownership over trans women's bodies is incredibly powerful. I did not realize how common these experiences were until I started to talk with other trans women about it. Many of us had experienced sexual assault, but these rejections of our boundaries were what cut us deep. The fetishization of our genitals, the sexualization of our bodies. And that's how the zine ends, sort of after 40 pages, examining Tasha's like involvement in survival sex work, on living on the street, on her own, journey through negotiating queerness and negotiating her own trans identity. These are all sort of moments that culminate in this very powerful poetic ending of just saying, like the way that cis people define and own trans bodies is something that is very much a type of cultural production, maybe a bad cultural production, I think it is, that these moments in time are all sort of situated and confounded on like these histories of oppression. Feinberg dedicates the beginning of her book to the memory of Stonewall. And in the same vein, I think we see these types of really like street-based grassroots organizations and people who are using trauma to combat the cultural production of cisnormativity and heterosexuality. These things are sort of happening all around us at all times for the last, 50 years. And they're happening right now, which is why I really wanted to showcase trauma. This came out in 2013. It came out a couple months ago, which is very serendipitous because I'm writing a paper on queer trauma and cultural production. But these sorts of things have always been happening and always been circulating, and now we're just sort of starting to unearth them.